In this video, we'll see how to use JSP standard tag library, aka JSTL. Web technologies like to use so-called custom tags, I guess because they are easier to learn even by non-programmers, since they look like HTML tags. This is an example in ASP.NET. In this example, a custom tag ASP column text box is used to generate a text box, and the ASP button tag will generate a button. Notice the difference between this text and the standard HTML tag paragraph, for example. And this is an example of custom tags in CodeFusion, which is a web technology developed by Adobe. And this is an example of using JSTL tags, which we'll study in this video. In this example, we have a custom tag out, which simply prints out a string. Let's create this JSP in Eclipse and see how it looks like. We'll create a new JSP file, and let's call it hello JSTL. And let's put this one in there. This is called a Techlib Directive, which we'll discuss a little bit more in a moment. And this, of course, is our tag. And let's run this. And the URL is hello.jstl.jsp. And this is what it looks like. It simply renders the text hello world in JSTL. If we look at the source, it's just this. So this is a simple example, but it shows a couple of important things. First, notice the use of the Techlib Directive. In JSP, we must use a Techlib Directive to declare a tag library before we can use the custom tags in that library. This is like Java code where we must import a package before we can use the classes in that package. Secondly, notice the two attributes of the Techlib Directive, URI and Prefix. A common misconception about the URI attribute is that it's the URL where the tag library can be downloaded because it looks like a URL. That is not correct. Although it looks like a URL, it is not. URI, remember, I stands for identifier. It's just a name or identifier for this tag library. The naming convention for tag library URI is to use the URL form, and the main purpose of that is to ensure the URI is unique. As for the prefix, it's simply a shorthand form for the tag library that later can be used inside the JSP. For example, here it says the prefix is C, so the tag C column out means the out tag in the C tag library. Technically, you can use any prefix you want. For example, we can call it ABC, and all we need to do is change this one to ABC, and it will work again. In practice, when it comes to using JSTL, people typically use the prefix C for the core tag library. There are, in fact, 5 tag libraries included in JSTL. The first is the core tag library, which is the one that we'll use most often. We'll also use the formatting tag library a little bit, especially the tags for formatting data and formatting numbers. The other 2 tag libraries, XML processing and the database access, are not very useful in a MVC web application because those things are typically done in controllers rather than using tags in views. The last library, the functions library, is actually not a tag library. It provides some functions mostly related to strings like string length, substring, and so on. And those functions can be used in expression language expressions. And very importantly, this is the URL for the documentation. And when you first use JSTL, you'll probably look up this documentation quite often, so keep that URL handy. Here is a list of important JSTL tags and functions. You must know how to use these tags and functions. We'll go over them one by one. We'll use this example from the last video. So in the last video, if you remember, we had an example called property test, and we had 2 model classes, each with some properties, and then we had a JSP that displays those properties using expression language. And if we look at it, it looks something like this, property test, and it displays the ID property of the A object, name property of the A object, A0 property of the B object, and so on and so forth. And in terms of the properties, we have a string property, a string array property called weekdays. If we have a list property, which contains a list of double values, which are randomly generated, and we also have a date property. In this video, we'll see how we use these tags using this one as an example. So we are not going to use B, so we can get rid of that. And we can also get rid of this part and only look at the A object. Okay, so the first tag I want to show is the branch tag cif. So suppose we want to display the full name of the weekday Monday, MON. So here, MON is the shorthand form MON, but let's say I want to display Monday instead. So the first thing we do before we can use any tag is to remember including the Techlib Directive. So let me copy over this one. This is the very first common mistake people tend to make when they start using JSTL, forgetting to include the Techlib Directive. So always remember to do this first before you do any JSTL stuff. And then let's say we want to do something like this. So we'll say see if, actually let's put it inside a paragraph. We'll say see if test, and we'll say a.weekdays if the first weekdays is Monday, then we will render Monday. And if we refresh, we can see that it says Monday here. Now, if we say change this to the second element in weekdays, second element in weekdays is Tuesday. So Tuesday is not going to match with MON, so this one will not be displayed. And just as we would expect. So this is a simple tag, and as tags go, most of them are pretty simple. After all, they are tags. All you need to do is put in the tag and put in a couple of attributes. So the first thing to understand it is what this thing does. So this tag takes a test attribute, and this test attribute should have either a true value or a false value. If the value of the test attribute is true, it renders the content of the tag, whatever it is. So it basically put the content of the tag into the HTML page generated by this JSP. If it is false, then nothing gets rendered. So that part is simple. Now the second part is very, very important, and it's, I would say, the single most important thing about using JSTL tags is to know when to use expression language and when not to. So remember, when we use HTML tags, the attribute, the value of an attribute usually looks like this. It's just double quotes and then whatever stuff inside. Now here, notice that we're putting in an expression language expression here rather than just a string. This is very, very important. The reason for this is if we look at the documentation, we can see that there's an attribute called test, and it is a required attribute, and very importantly, the type of the attribute is Boolean. Remember, everything in HTML is just text. If we just write it like this, then the value of this attribute is simply text, or in other words, a string. HTML by itself never gives us Boolean. So in order to have a Boolean value, we have to put a expression language expression here. So this is very important. When you look at the documentation of the JSTL tags, look for the type. If the type says string, that basically tells you that it can be simply a string like this. This would simply be a string. However, if it says anything other than a string, you'll have to use expression here. As I keep saying, this is the single most important thing about using JSTL, is to know when to use expression and when not. And in this case here, because this is a Boolean value, we have to use an expression to produce a Boolean value. Okay, so this is the first example about doing essentially an if statement. We can, of course, do something like a switch statement, and using JSTL, that will take three tags together: see truth, see when, and see otherwise. It's basically just like a switch statement in Java. In Java, you have a switch statement block, and here is the see truth tag. And inside see truth, you would have one or more when tags, and each when tag corresponds to a case statement inside the switch statement. And of course, the otherwise tag corresponds to the default statement in a switch statement. And the semantics is the same as in if tag. If the value of the test attribute evaluates to true, it renders the content of the tag. If it evaluates to false, it simply skip it. And in the case of C true, C win, and C otherwise, it will try each condition sequentially. If a condition is met, it will render that part and ends. If none of the conditions met, it will render whatever in the C otherwise tag. C otherwise is not required. You can just have several when tags, and if none of them evaluates to true, then this tag simply produces no output. As you would expect, after if statement, we have loop statement, and that tag is called C for each. This is a tag that you'll use very often because we need this to iterate through a collection. For example, here I have a list of numbers, and they will have randomly generated values. And if I want to display all of them, I would need a loop tag like this. So let's say I want to display all of the numbers in the numbers collection. We could do something like this. We can say for each items is a.numbers, and the var, let's call it number, and then we can say li number, something like this. Actually, let me just get rid of the rest of this so that we can focus on the new things. Okay, so I think, yeah, let's change this to 0 so we see Monday on top. Okay, so this is a list of numbers, and we are currently displaying all of them. And by looking at this tag, you can kind of tell what each one does. So the items attribute takes a collection of values, and the var attribute defines a variable with this name, and then inside the loop, in each iteration, this variable will take on the value in that collection of that for that iteration. So if the collection has numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and in each iteration, this variable will take on the value 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this is why we get all of these values. So the meaning of this is easy to understand. Once again, the key thing here is the type of the attributes. Notice that here we're using an expression language expression, and here we're just using a string. If we look at the documentation, we can see var is indeed a string type, meaning that we can simply give it a string, and this string will be the name of the variable used for the iteration. This one, however, is not a string type. This one is an object type and is supposed to be the collection of items to iterate over. So This is why, again, we have to use expression language here in order to have a collection. Otherwise, if you forgot the expression language part, it won't give you an error right away, but it will treat this as a string. It's no longer a collection, so obviously you won't be able to get what you want. Again, remember, sometimes expression language expression and sometimes just string. The for each tag is basically the so-called enhanced for loop in Java, where the value of the var attribute is the variable name, and the items attribute is a collection. If you are familiar with this type of for loop in Java, you should find this for each tag very easy to understand. For each tag has there's another way to use for each tag, basically like a regular for loop in Java. Meaning, for example, in Java, we would say something like for I equals to 0, I less than 10 plus plus I, and then use I as an index to iterate through an array or a collection. And we can do the same thing for using for each tag as well. So we can, for example, let's call this the regular for loop, and let's call this one the enhanced for loop, and in the let's move if down here, and the regular for loop will look like this. We'll say C for each. We'll say begin with 0 and with 10, because we have 10 numbers in the collection, and we say step is 1, so each time it will be incremented by 1, and the variable name is I, and we can then do a.numbers bracket I, and line 12. Oh, I forgot the S is called, the property is called numbers, not number. So the regular for loop gives us this, and the enhanced for loop gives us this. I think the regular for loop gives us one more. That means we probably should end earlier than 10. So it will be from 0 to 9 instead of 0 to 10. Let's try again. Yes. So 2 ways to use for each. You can use the enhanced for loop format, or you can use the regular for loop format with indexes. For each tag has another attribute called var status, which is often useful. Var status is just like var. You use that to define another variable, and this variable will contain some information about each iteration. You can find out what information it provides by looking at the API documentation. And these are the getters of that var status variable, and of course, if there are getters, there are properties. We can, if you use the regular for loop type, you can get the beginning index, you can get the end index, you can get the steps, and so on. And if you use the enhanced for loop format, you can get the current item, you can get the current index of the iteration, you can get whether it's the first iteration or whether it's the last iteration. So the way to do it is like this. You can specify, for example, var status, and let's define another variable, and the name doesn't really matter. I usually call that variable status. And then we can say status dot some property. Now exactly what property you want to see, you can find out. These are the ones you can select. Let's use index, and we'll say status dot index. And you can see that each time var status provide the index of the current iteration from 0, 1, 2, 3 up to 9. And similarly, you can access other properties inside each iteration. So this is it for C for each tag. And then there's a tag called URL. This tag is used to render a URL. The usage of it is usually a bit awkward because, as you can see, you usually need to put the whole tag inside the href attribute of an anchor tag. So you will have a tag inside another tag inside the double quotes, which looks kind of awkward. The main purpose of this tag is when you want to generate a URL that is relative to the root of the application. And this sometimes can be a little bit difficult because depending on where your application is deployed, the root path of the application can be different. For example, when you run your code on your local computer in Eclipse, notice that the root path of this application is actually /JSTL/, and that's because the project is called JSTL. However, if you deploy this project to CL3, you will notice that the root path of the project becomes something like CS3220, STO31, or something like that. So creating a URL relative to the application root sometimes is not that easy. But if you use the URL tag, it becomes pretty easy because it automatically append the actual application root in front of this. You can simply just say /. So to show this, let's say I put a URL in here, and let's say the URL is /abcd. Yeah, just call it /abcd. We just want to test it out. Doesn't have to link to anything. So if we refresh, notice that this tag renders a path, renders a path /JSTL/abcd, meaning that it appends the root path of the application in front. And this way, regardless of where this project is deployed, this URL or this path is always going to be relative to the application root. And that sometimes is quite quite useful. And then the alt tag. The alt tag lets you render a value. For example, if you say cout and give it a value hello, it will render hello, and that's it. Just like that. Now you look at this, you may be wondering, why do I need this tag to do that? I could just put hello here and it will do the same. And you are right, you would be right. So if you just have a simple value like this, you don't really need the cout tag. You can just put the value directly inside the JSP. And if you just have an expression, and you can put the expression directly inside JSP, you don't really need the cout tag. So when is this tag useful? There are two situations. One, when the text you want to render has special characters in it. Remember, in HTML, certain characters are considered special characters. For example, brackets are used for tags, and the quotes are used for attribute values. And if some text contain these special characters, they should be escaped by converting them to these special escape sequences. And you can use cout to do that if the value you want to render or the text you want to render contains special characters. Another situation is when you have, for example, a file that you want to include in a response, but you don't want to read the whole file into memory and buffer it there before you write it to a response. So what you can do is you can open the file in a file reader object, and you simply pass that reader object to cout as the value of the value attribute. What cout will do is it will read the file and stream it into a response without buffering the whole thing in memory, and that's much more efficient than reading the whole file into memory first. So these are really the only two situations where you want to use cout. The second situation, admittedly, is not very common, so for the most part, it's just the first situation. Example would be something like this. If we say cout value, let's say a less than b and b greater than c. So suppose we want to say a less than b and b greater than c, but because brackets are special characters in HTML, if we don't escape it, the browser will consider this as a b tag instead of just less than and greater than. But with cout, it's correctly recognized as less than and greater than, and if we see the source, we can see that cout automatically escaped those two special characters. Now let's try use a couple of formatting tags, starting with the format date tag, which we use quite often, in fact, because dates are used quite often in web applications. And here I do have a date value, and if I simply display it, a.date, it will show up like this. What if we want to format it a little bit? Well, the first thing is we can use the format tag. But before we do that, the real first thing is we have to import the format tag library. Remember, there are 5 tag libraries in JSTL. Importing the core library only gives us the tags in the core library. Now we want to use this one. So we'll do the same thing, except we'll need to use the URI of the formatting library, and we'll give it a different prefix, and the typically used prefix for the formatting library is FMT, and then we can use the tags in the formatting library. To format a date, we can simply specify the date as the value of the value attribute. Note that because it's a data object, not a string object, again, we are going to use expression here. And then we can specify how it's formatted. There are a few predefined formats. We can say date, we can say time, we can say both. And if you are not happy with any of the predefined formats, you can use a pattern to format it. And the pattern is the same pattern used in Java. So if you don't remember what these pattern symbols represent, please check out the API documentation. Basically, this one says 4 digits for year after a dash, and then 1 or 2 digits for month, 1 or 2 digits for days, and hour and minutes, and so on. So let's try the first one first. So if I do SM format date, and then the value is this one, and the type is date. So you can see it formats the whole thing as just date. And if we say time, it will just format it as time, and of course both will format it as both. But if you are not happy with any of that, we can use the pattern. We can say pattern, and then let's say I want 1 or 2 digits for month, 1 or 2 digits for date, and then 4 digits for year, and it will look like this. So this is how we can format date, and the formatting number is very similar. There are a number of predefined formats. You can format it as a regular number, as a currency, as a percentage, or you can specify a pattern. Again, the symbols used for pattern is the same ones used for Java. So check out the documentation if you are not familiar with that. So here, let's format this one, and let's say we format these numbers, and we'll say format number, and the value is this, and we'll use a pattern to format them. And what do they look like? Okay, so we'll keep 1 digit before the decimal point, and 3 digits after. And let's see what they look like. Now they look like this. And you can see the original values in the second loop. Okay, now let's see how to use the JSTL functions, in particular the length function. If you look at the API documentation, you can see the functions are done here. And most of these functions are related to strings, whether a string contains another string, whether a string ends with something, whether the length of the string replaces a substring, and so on and so forth. Most of these are related to strings, and most of those are not all that useful. The one that I find most useful is this length function. The length function, the reason it's useful is because it not only works on strings, you can use it to get the length of a string, of course, but more importantly, you can use it to get the size of a collection, which is often more useful than getting the length of a string. Notice that the functions libraries provide functions, not tags. So this obviously is quite different from this tags. These functions are called expression language functions, meaning that you use them inside the expression, not by themselves. Take this one as an example. So let's say, well, again, we have to import it first. So let's do Techlib again, and this time we need to import the functions library, which is this one. And the prefix is usually fn, and then once we have that, we can then use all the functions in the library inside the expression. So we can say something like, there are fn length a.numbers values in a.numbers, something like this. And it will say there are 10 values in a.numbers. Once again, remember this is not a tag library, it's an expression language function library. You use these functions inside the expression. So these are the important JSTL tags and functions that you have to know how to use. I want to emphasize that these are server-side tags, meaning that they are interpreted by the application server, which then renders HTML in HTTP response. In other words, you should never see these tags in a browser. If you see them in a browser, chances are you forgot to include the Techlib Directive, or you missed this one. What I mean by that is, if you do a view source in your browser, you'll see that there are only regular HTML tags there. There's no custom tag or JSTL, because those tags are interpreted by application server. The application server uses them to essentially generate HTML, but those tags themselves should not be sent back to the client. If they are, that means you forgot Techlib directives. Okay, so now with JSTL, our knowledge about JSP as a template engine is complete. In particular, expression language gives us the capability to access objects and their properties, and also allows us to write simple expressions. JSTL, on the other hand, gives us the control flow structures, in particular the branch and the loop structures, like the if tag and the for each tag. It also provides some additional utilities such as formatting, generate URL, escape special characters, and so on. So with all those, now we can implement some display logic in JSP. What we'll do is we'll first go back to the guestbook example, convert it to MVC, and see how everything works together. In order to keep this video short, I'm going to do that in a separate video.